The business class cabin was bright with soft midday light, the engine hum a steady drone. In the front row, CEO Vivian Sterling, in a bespoke suit, complained sharply into her phone about the boarding delay. A single father, Elias Thorne, dressed simply, waited quietly by the divider. She cast a cutting, whispered remark to her assistant. "Some people don't belong up here," clearly slowing the system. The plane lifted off. Moments later, an unusual, rhythmic vibration ran through the floor. An alert light flickered, then went dark. The intercom clicked on, the captain's voice low and grave. "Ladies and gentlemen." The cabin fell utterly silent. Elias Thorne, 38, was accustomed to invisibility. His life as a single father required absolute focus on pragmatism, optimizing his modest budget, ensuring his 10-year-old daughter, Emily, excelled in school, and traveling cheaply for contract work. Today, he was flying cross-country to secure a critical, short-term engineering contract, a necessary sacrifice. He was currently positioned at the rear of the business class partition, waiting for the restroom to clear, a man clearly outside the social strata of the front cabin. He wore simple, practical clothing that contrasted starkly with the soft wool and diamond watches surrounding him. Elias found silence and anonymity to be his greatest tools. His past was a carefully closed book. Before Emily was born, Elias was known by his call sign, Wraith, a top-tier U.S. Navy F/A-18 pilot. He hadn't just flown, he had pushed the limits of modern aviation, mastering maneuvers that defied common sense, all while managing the constant stress of carrying an incredible weapon system. That life ended abruptly with the tragic loss of his wife and the realization that his daughter needed a father who was physically present, not perpetually deployed to the edge of the world. Now his observation skills were applied to structural integrity audits and contract timelines, not hostile airspace. The fighter pilot was retired, but the discipline remained ingrained, a ghost in his quiet life. He saw the tension in the flight attendant's posture, the hurried, low-volume communication between the gate agent and the co-pilot, and the immediate sharp shift in the cabin's energy. Elias's eyes didn't just see, they cataloged. The stress lines around the captain's eyes during the pre-flight walk-around, the slight delay in the flap retraction after takeoff, the overall subtle scent of ozone that suggested overworked electrical systems. Vivian Sterling, the CEO, was the architect of a major financial tech firm. She had built her empire on aggressive efficiency and zero tolerance for perceived incompetence. To Vivian, delay was a moral failing, and status was absolute. She viewed the brief pause caused by the slow movement of the economy passengers as an affront to her schedule and her power. Her cutting comment, intended only for her assistant, had been loud enough to carry, a subtle verbal push designed to establish the rigid hierarchy of the cabin. She believed her words were simply stating an obvious truth, that the people who belonged in the front section were those who valued and generated efficiency. The silent man standing near the divider, with his inexpensive luggage and patient demeanor, represented the inefficient delay she loathed, a glitch in her perfectly scheduled life. Elias had heard the remark. He felt the sting, brief and shallow, but he immediately dismissed it. He understood that her aggression was a byproduct of her own internal pressure, not a true assessment of him. He knew that the kind of certainty she displayed was often rooted in ignorance of true complexity. He kept his head slightly bowed, offering no response, no challenge, no defense. Confrontation was a waste of energy he needed for the long journey ahead. As the jet roared and pushed them back into their seats, Elias focused his attention entirely on the machine. He didn't rely on the feeling of speed. He listened to the complex harmony of the engines and the airframe. He could differentiate the smooth, high-pitched turbine whine from the lower-frequency roar of the exhaust. Shortly after they leveled off, a subtle, low-frequency shudder began. It was not the familiar buffeting of turbulence, which tended to be random and gusty. This was a deeper, more mechanical strain, a rhythmic beat that felt slightly off-tempo, almost like a tired heart skipping a beat. Elias's years of highly specialized experience told him this was unusual. It felt like a minor structural load or an asymmetrical drag issue. Perhaps a control surface was fluttering, or a landing gear door hadn't fully seated. While likely a problem for the maintenance crew, not the passengers, it immediately escalated his internal status from relaxed traveler to passive observer. A flight attendant, moving through the aisle, offered a practiced, cheerful reassurance. "Just a bit of slight weather, folks. Nothing to worry about." A passenger nearby chuckled, waving the comment away. "Just another bumpy ride." But Elias didn't smile. He subtly placed his palm flat against the armrest, feeling the irregular thrum directly through the frame, analyzing the vibration's frequency and amplitude. He knew the difference between atmospheric noise and mechanical dissonance. He trusted the tactile evidence of the machine more than the smooth scripted words broadcast through the cabin's speakers. The small anomaly registered deep in his quiet mind, filed away as a low-level, critical alert. Elias settled back into his seat, his gaze distant, his body outwardly relaxed. But his entire being was now unconsciously listening to the complex, strained rhythm of the aircraft above the clouds. He began mentally cataloging emergency procedures, a habit he hadn't fully shed in 10 years. The low, uneven vibration that Elias had detected in Act 1 returned with a vengeance. No longer a subtle thrum, but a violent, whipping wobble that resonated through the entire airframe. Loose objects rattled violently in the overhead bins. The cheerful cabin lights flickered, casting the cabin into momentary darkness before normalizing, only to flicker again with the increasing power of the destabilization. This time, the pilot did not make an announcement. The urgency on the flight deck precluded any pleasantries. In the cockpit, the communication was clipped, rapid, and strained. The first officer was calling out rapidly deteriorating flight parameters. IAS decaying, pitch oscillating, +5, -3, severe lateral asymmetry, I can't hold the roll. An unexpected severe failure had occurred in the primary flight control systems, specifically affecting the trim on one side. A crucial actuator had jammed, leaving a single control surface fixed in a position that was creating significant asymmetrical lift and drag. They were struggling with an uncontrollable yaw moment, forcing the aircraft into a difficult, barely manageable turn. The captain, Robert Bob Hayes, a veteran of 25 years with a pristine safety record, was fighting the controls, his knuckles white against the yoke, his forehead beaded with sweat. He was using every ounce of his training, but commercial flight training focused on procedural responses, not raw, instinctive, high-energy control recovery. Their initial attempts to correct the issue using conventional secondary controls, differential spoilers, slight rudder adjustments, were only minimally effective. The first officer repeatedly ran the checklist, his voice cracking with tension. They were in a race against time, trying to stabilize the plane before the sustained aerodynamic instability led to a high-altitude stall, a situation that, at this weight and altitude, was potentially unrecoverable. "We're losing effective control authority, Bob. The roll rate is increasing." In the cabin, the veneer of luxury and calm shattered. Flight attendants moved with a strained, silent urgency, securing the serving carts, checking the emergency exits, and preparing the passengers for the worst-case scenario. Their practiced smiles were gone, replaced by expressions of grim professionalism. They maintained their composure only through sheer, disciplined willpower. Maria, the attendant Elias had briefly spoken to, moved through the aisle, her lips thin, reciting the standard emergency brace command, her voice barely steady. Vivian Sterling, the CEO, was no longer in control. Her face, usually a mask of sharp assurance, was pale and damp. She attempted to call her assistant, but the network was gone. She clutched the armrests, her anxiety manifesting as an attempt to regain control through useless action. "What is happening? Demand they tell us. This is unacceptable." Her voice was high-pitched, thin, and desperate, a stark contrast to the calm, commanding tone she used to run her global corporation. Her wealth and status were utterly useless at 35,000 feet. The irony was devastating. She was dependent on the competency of others, the very quality she had so easily dismissed in Elias. Elias, in his economy seat, was rock solid. He didn't need the cockpit announcement to understand the danger. The violent motions confirmed his worst initial suspicion, a mechanical failure causing dynamic instability. His muscle memory, a powerful force refined through years of combat aviation, had taken over. He analyzed the aircraft's movements, the subtle, almost imperceptible drop of the port wing, indicating severe drag or lift loss on that side, the rapid oscillating correction attempts by the crew, and the constant, low-frequency battle the airframe was losing against the wind. He recognized the telltale sensation of a developing dynamic instability that often precedes a deep or high-G stall. Unlike commercial pilots, fighter pilots were trained to recover from spins and stalls near the edge of the envelope. His mind was rapidly calculating the solution, drawing on years of simulator time and high-G experience. He needed to know the exact failure, but the symptoms pointed clearly to a crucial trim or control surface failure. Suddenly, a passenger, a middle-aged man from the business section, stood up, shaking and shouting, "We have a right to know. Are we going down? Call an emergency landing." His panic was infectious. An attendant rushed over, trying desperately to calm him and enforce the remain seated instruction. But the shouting only fueled the general terror. Panic ripped through the aisles like an electrical current, threatening to become mass hysteria. Elias saw the attendants struggling and knew they were seconds from a full-blown cabin riot, which would only distract the flight crew further. He calmly reached out and grasped the arm of the panicking man, not with force, but with the sudden, overwhelming authority of a man who understands true danger. "Sir, sit down, now. You are distracting the crew. They are fighting the controls. Your life depends on their focus." His voice was low, deep, and utterly devoid of panic, cutting through the man's hysteria like a laser. The man, stunned by the sudden, focused calm from the quiet stranger, immediately collapsed back into his seat, temporarily subdued, ashamed of his outburst. Elias looked at Maria and nodded once, a gesture of quiet support. He knew the captain was in a profound dilemma. Attempt a high-speed, structurally demanding emergency maneuver that might rip the wings off or risk a fatal aerodynamic failure from the uncontrolled stall. The moment of decision had arrived, and the crew was running out of conventional options. The only variable missing was a set of skills honed not in the predictable world of commercial flight, but in the extreme reflexive environment of a high-performance military jet. The aircraft shuddered violently again, and the cabin lights went completely dark, plunging the interior into a terrifying, sustained gloom. The collective intake of breath across the cabin sounded like a painful, desperate sigh. The plane is in freefall, the captain is out of options, and the cabin is in a panic. If you'd like to see how this life-or-death moment unfolds, you're welcome to subscribe and continue with us. The sudden, absolute darkness was the final trigger for panic. Shrieks erupted, and the sound of rushed, desperate prayer filled the space. The aircraft began to lose altitude rapidly, the heavy, sinking sensation pressing everyone into their seatbelts. The air rushed past the fuselage with a terrifying moan, and the plane entered a cycle of increasingly steep dives and jarring recoveries. Then the flight deck intercom cut through the cacophony. The captain's voice was strained, heavy with the gravity of his last resort decision, but absolutely clear, ringing with a desperate plea. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have experienced a severe flight control malfunction. We have exhausted our current procedural options, and the aircraft is currently uncontrollable." The entire cabin froze. Every sound, every breath, every thought seemed to stop. The fear was a tangible, icy pressure in the air. He took a deep, audible breath, a sound that amplified the sheer helplessness of the situation. "We need highly specialized, non-standard expertise. We are dealing with an extreme asymmetric thrust-to-drag issue that requires non-conventional recovery input." He paused for a beat, the most critical pause of his life. I repeat, is there any fighter pilot, experienced military aviator, or high-performance aircraft engineer on board? Someone with experience recovering from severe aerodynamic stalls near the edge of the flight envelope. Please notify the nearest flight attendant immediately. The request was so far outside the realm of normal commercial flight that it was almost incomprehensible. Fighter pilot? A savior from a Top Gun movie, materialized in coach? Who would ever expect that? Vivian Sterling, whose eyes had been shut in terror, snapped her head up. She looked around the now dimly lit business cabin. The powerful men and women, the titans of industry, were all seated, stunned, pale and silent. Not a single person rose. Her eyes swept the cabin, desperately searching for the one person her status dictated would be the savior. A person who looked like her, who dressed like her, who belonged up there, perhaps a private jet owner or a retired airline executive. Then slowly, deliberately, a figure rose from his seat in the economy section, past the divider. It was Elias Thorne, the man in the simple polo shirt she had dismissed with a scornful word only an hour ago. He didn't move quickly, but with a quiet, efficient confidence. Stepping into the business class aisle, his eyes fixed on the front of the plane. The nearest flight attendant, Maria, whose hands were shaking, looked at him in disbelief, her hope warring with her terror. Elias spoke, his voice carrying the deep, unwavering calm of command, the tone of a person giving orders in a crisis. Maria, I am a former U.S. Navy FA-18 pilot. I have extensive experience in high AOA recovery and asymmetrical thrust vectoring. Tell the captain I am here to assist. My designation is Elias. The revelation stunned the cabin into a deeper, more profound silence. Elias didn't wait for permission or fanfare. He moved immediately toward the front, speaking concise, technical language to Maria that confirmed his bona fides beyond any doubt. I need the current indicated airspeed, pitch and roll. Crucially, I need the trim status on the horizontal stabilizer and the degree of effective aileron input. I need to know the specific system failure that created the hard over trim. Maria, recognizing the technical mastery and the immediate, focused analysis in his voice, relayed the information through the secure phone line to the cockpit. The captain, desperate and grasping at the faintest thread of hope, didn't hesitate this time. He followed the necessary protocol to secure the cabin and open the armored flight deck door. Elias stepped inside the cockpit, a tiny, cramped world filled with flashing red lights, blaring electronic warnings, and the heavy tension of life and death struggle. The captain and first officer looked utterly defeated. Elias didn't rush. He didn't attempt to physically take the yoke. Instead, he leaned over the captain's shoulder, his eyes instantly locking onto the critical instruments, processing the data stream in milliseconds. The failure is the right outboard trim tab, fixed at maximum deflection, Elias stated, synthesizing the data instantly. The instability is a result of the extreme trim asymmetry combined with the current airspeed. You are generating massive drag on the right wing, but your conventional aileron and rudder inputs are just fighting the drag, not fixing the lift profile. This is a classic asymmetric load profile. We can't beat the physics with standard inputs. He looked at the captain, whose face was etched with terror and responsibility, the weight of 400 lives heavy on his shoulders. Captain, I need you to do something counterintuitive. You have to increase thrust on the low, left side engine by 15%, and simultaneously, you have to apply negative aileron input on the high side. It will feel wrong. It will increase the yaw, and the plane will momentarily feel like it's slipping out from under you, but it will use the asymmetric thrust and the induced lift from the opposite aileron to stabilize the lift profile. This is a controlled high G slip to correct the lift imbalance. The captain hesitated, sweat pouring down his temples. That will put us into a high G slip. That's not in the manual. I'll risk structural failure or an uncontrolled spin. The spin is guaranteed if you maintain current inputs, Elias insisted, his voice now a single decisive command, cutting through the noise. You are already experiencing control reversal. Trust the angle of attack. Do it now, Captain. Left throttle forward, right aileron down, shallow rudder. Swallowing his terror, the captain obeyed, his hands trembling as he performed the precise, reflexive adjustment. The aircraft groaned violently, yawing sharply to the side, a sickening sideways movement that caused the remaining silent passengers to cry out and brace for impact. But then, as the asymmetric thrust began to cancel the asymmetric drag, the rhythmic shudder stopped. The pressure on the controls eased miraculously. The airframe settled into a stable, controlled attitude, no longer fighting the sky, but gliding smoothly forward. The red warning lights flickered, hesitated, and then slowly, one by one, turned green, replaced by the soft glow of routine instruments. Elias watched the instruments stabilize. He nodded once, a gesture of finality and competence. Stable. You have control, Captain. Maintain current heading. Reduce left throttle to match. Monitor the differential for any further deviation. He had spent less than 90 seconds inside the cockpit, executing a non-standard recovery maneuver that had pulled 400 people back from the edge of catastrophe. He was a master of extreme, low-probability events, and he had executed the impossible. Elias quietly exited the cockpit, the door sealing behind him with a hydraulic hiss, the only sound that broke the absolute disbelieving silence of the cabin. The flight attendants, including Maria, stared at him, their faces slack with shock, relief, and utter admiration. They didn't applaud or cheer. The relief was too heavy for such a common expression. The sheer, overwhelming competence they had just witnessed defied public expression. A few moments later, the cabin lights returned to full brightness, and the plane settled into a smooth, steady cruising rhythm. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, sounding utterly exhausted but profoundly relieved. Ladies and gentlemen, we have resolved the operational issue. The flight path is now stable. We will continue to our destination. Thank you for your cooperation. He omitted any mention of the hero, maintaining professional discretion, but the gratitude was thick in his voice. Vivian Sterling, the CEO, sat utterly frozen in her seat. Her bespoke suit felt heavy, her diamond watch suddenly meaningless. She was staring, not at the front of the plane, but across the cabin divider, at the empty economy seat where Elias Thorne now stood, quietly slipping back into the crowd. The realization hit her with the physical force of a blow, a punch to her carefully constructed reality. The quiet man, the simple man, the man she had mocked for slowing the system and for not belonging, was the sole reason she was still breathing. Her wealth, her power, her sharp wit, none of it could buy the reflexive, life-saving skill that had just been deployed. Her look of aristocratic superiority was utterly gone. Her face held only profound, raw astonishment and a burning, debilitating shame. She was speechless, her control dissolved by a humbling truth. The judgment she had cast on him, the assumption that he didn't belong, had become the single most significant act of injustice in her life, a mistake of character that almost cost her everything. She tried to formulate a sentence, a sophisticated acknowledgement, but only a dry, shaking gasp escaped her lips. Elias made his way back to his row, moving slowly and deliberately. Several passengers attempted to catch his eye, offering hesitant smiles or silent, grateful nods. But Elias offered no encouragement. He didn't acknowledge the praise, treating his heroic action as simply a necessary duty. A man who had shouted earlier reached out a hand, but Elias gently bypassed it. He found his seat, pulled the buckle of his seatbelt tight, and returned to his original posture, calm, observant, and detached. Maria, the flight attendant, stopped at his seat, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Mr. Thorne, thank you. We owe you our lives. I won't forget this." "Ami," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Elias simply shook his head, offering a slight, dismissive motion. "It was part of the procedure, Maria. I just identified the right corrective action." He refused the offered spotlight, the public validation, the chance to shame the very people who had looked down on him. His skill was his own reward. His silence spoke louder than any shouted declaration, confirming a powerful, undeniable truth. True capacity doesn't require status or a suit to be recognized. It only requires execution when everything else fails. The plane completed its journey with impeccable smoothness. The sense of shared peril had vanished, replaced by an atmosphere of quiet, respectful contemplation. No one spoke loudly, and the usual hustle for bags was replaced by patient queuing. As the landing gear dropped and the aircraft prepared to taxi, the captain came over the intercom one last time. His voice was warm, sincere, and deeply emotional. "We landed safely thanks to the professionalism of the crew, and the invaluable assistance of a highly skilled individual we are proud to have had on board today. To that individual, a deeply felt, personal thanks from the flight deck. Their presence was truly an act of destiny. He still offered no name, respecting Elias's clear desire for anonymity. As the doors opened and the passengers began to file out, Vivian Sterling, the CEO, remained stationary. She waited patiently until the aisle was nearly empty, letting the economy passengers, the people she had judged, exit first. Her haste and her schedule were now meaningless. Then she moved forward slowly, her expensive leather shoes clicking softly on the floor, intercepting Elias near the exit door. She did not posture. She did not attempt to negotiate or offer a job. She simply stood before him, her shoulders slightly slumped, her customary authority vanished, replaced by a painful sense of humility. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice barely a whisper, strained and raw, "I owe you an apology that words cannot cover. My remarks earlier, they were callous and entirely wrong. I judged you based on appearance and assumptions, an arrogance I now see clearly. I was saved by the man I mocked. There is no justification for my behavior." She extended her hand, not for a handshake, but as a gesture of profound respect. Elias looked at her, his expression placid and understanding, free of malice or triumph. He saw not the CEO, but a deeply humbled woman who had just faced her mortality and her own moral failure. He accepted her hand briefly, a firm, non-committal clasp. "Apology accepted, ma'am," he said softly. "We all make mistakes in judgment. The important thing is that we're all safe now, and you learned what needed to be learned." She paused, seemingly searching for the right word, the right offer, the compensation she felt obligated to give. She started to reach into her pocket for a card. Elias anticipated the gesture and gently ended the moment. "My flight is connecting soon," he said, offering a small, polite smile. "Please have a safe trip." He didn't offer a business card. He didn't ask for her number. He didn't leverage the life he had just saved for a contract or a connection. His silence was the final lesson. He simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowded terminal, a single father returning to his quiet, essential life, carrying only the satisfaction of a mission expertly completed. Vivian stood alone for a long moment, watching him go, the heavy weight of her lessons settling upon her heart. The incident was over, the emergency contained, the plane returned to its routine. But for everyone on board, the experience offered a profound lesson, that true worth is not measured by the class of seat one occupies, but by the skill and character one carries inside. Fate sometimes asks only one terrifying question: is there a fighter pilot on board? And the right person, the one who truly belongs, will always be the one who quietly stands up. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe. True skill speaks when it's needed,